Summer routines live or die by how easy they are, and honestly, if something takes too much effort, I'm out. That's why Groons is my go-to. It's my one daily pack of gummies covering my greens, vitamins, and minerals. Plus, it has 6 grams of prebiotic fiber, which is more than 2 cups of broccoli. No mixing powders, no giant pills, no hassle. I just rip open the pack and I'm done. They taste good and they make it easy to stay on top of my health, even when life gets busy. Save up to 52% with the code PODCAST at Groons.co. That's code PODCAST at GRUNS.co.
Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I am your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 163, recording on Thursday, April 30th. Thank you guys for being here. I'm Alec Lewis. I cover the Vikings for The Athletic. Do this show twice a week, every single week, and we absolutely love having a direct contact to you guys who care about this team at an unbelievable level. If you're new here and watch on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button right below. It helps us out. And if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, or iHeart, you can follow us over there. You can hit the stars. I think that's supposed to do something, and rate us and review us, and we appreciate all of that. On this show, going to take a bunch of your questions. Usually we do the mailbag early in the week. This week, because we had Dane Brugler, the Athletics phenomenal draft analyst, early in the week, we flipped it. Going to take questions, and there's a lot of subjects to talk about, whether it's Jauan Jennings, the GM search, ton of little nuggets will be dispersed throughout. So thank you guys for being here. Hope you enjoy the show. We are presented by First Resource Bank. If you don't know about it, that is a member FDIC bank in the Minneapolis area, run by really good people. Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, and Charlie Anderson. They are Vikings fans, just like you guys, and they have built one of the, if not the preeminent bank in the upper Midwest here, with branches all over the place and a great online banking platform. So please go check out First Resource Bank nearby or in the description below. Show's also sponsored by ProMN. You guys are probably like, what is ProMN Athletics? Well, a group of 3 guys, Kurt, Graham, and Tanner. They came together, I believe it was last year, and they're like, look, our kids, played football. We played football growing up. We want youth development at the youth level in Minnesota for football to be as good as it can possibly be. So let's band together and create what they've created: some winter academies, spring academies, summer 7-on-7 leagues, and really like a mentorship program for kids who love football at all positions, with guys who played it at the college level, like Tanner Morgan, the former quarterback in Minnesota, and like a bunch of his buddies who played all sorts of positions. So they've given kids advice on the college, process, on the camp circuit, all of that. So if your son plays football, if you know anybody whose kids play football, I highly recommend going to check out ProMN. All right. First of all, before we get into the questions, if you missed it at The Athletic on Thursday, I had kind of a draft pick confidential. So it was at least 15 people over the course of the last 4 days who are college coaches, who know a lot of these picks, personnel people. Highly recommend that, and I'll probably cite it throughout this show. The first question comes from Dustin at Dust_Vikings, and the question is, what is the deal with Jauan Jennings, with an eyeball emoji? So if you guys have stayed off your phone since the draft, you're like, I was so invested for these 3 days, I gotta relax, and you missed it. You probably didn't see that Jauan Jennings, who has been a receiver for the San Francisco 49ers for multiple years, former 7th round pick, who has had a really good career, spent time here in Minnesota with the Vikings on Tuesday and Wednesday. That visit was always kind of an exploratory type feel. It was never billed as Jauan Jennings is coming here, it's signing, done deal, over with, and done for. It was always more of a, hey, you come meet us, we're going to spend time with you, see where you're at, talk through everything, fit, role, what we're about, what this building is about, and then obviously some of the financial kind of ideas with where both sides kind of stand. So that's just the first place I'd start. Is just because Jauan Jennings was visiting was never it was never like, if this doesn't happen, if he walks out of the building by Wednesday, what are we doing? The sky is falling. Do the Vikings even know what's happening? Like that? Not at all. That's not. I think any expectation that that's what this was about just probably doesn't hit the mark. I'd say Jauan Jennings, he turns 29 this summer. He's coming off two huge receiving years. I mean, I believe he had 50 plus catches in 2024. I think he had 77 catches in 2025. It could be flipped with those 2 years, so I could check that, but don't want to slow down this podcast. But he's caught a lot of passes in recent years. I know he had 9 touchdowns in 2025. And the thing that I think has separated him over the course of his career, probably why San Francisco took the chance when they did in the draft in the 7th round years and years ago, was of his physicality, of his grittiness, of his willingness as a run blocker. Like he widely has been known over the last few years as one of the premier pass catching run blockers in the NFL. And if you think about the Vikings offenses, since Kevin O'Connell got here, early on they had KJ Osborne who kind of filled that role. In 2024 it was Trent Sherfield. Last year, not a ton of options to kind of, you know, just provide that skill set. And so Jauan Jennings, I think if he were to ultimately be signed, and I'd say it's definitely possible in the future here, he would probably be the best run blocking receiver that the Vikings have had since Kevin O'Connell got here in 2022. Now, I will say this. I went back and watched some of the film of Jauan Jennings just to familiarize myself with this player and to be able to bring you guys the most accurate depiction of what he is and what he could be. I watched the tape of the Rams game he played in the middle of the season in 2025, I mean, this is not a knock because I believe he played through a ton of injuries, but I'd say the run blocking juice and like physicality that you often pair with a guy in your mind like a Jauan Jennings, I didn't see that as much on that specific tape. So I think, part of the visit, I'd say part of the question, part of the monetary compensation component of it all is like, what is he going to be for this Vikings team? Does he want to be, given the production he's had, the 70 catch type of player? If he does, considering what the Vikings already have, what does that look like? What makes sense from that standpoint? I think like that's part of what this exploratory feel is and has been. And then, we'll just see over the course of the next few days, weeks, months, does another team want to sign him for his certain value? I mean, you guys might wonder, like, well, Alex, what would the price tag be? Like, what is a guy like his value? I mean, Jalen Naylor, who was 27 years old, who didn't have the production that Jauan Jennings had, signed for about $11.6 million in average annual value. So you'd probably think it'd be more than that. I mean, a guy like Mike Evans, who is a future Hall of Famer, obviously has had a lot of injuries and is 33 years old and not 28, about to be 29. He signed for about 14.1 million in average annual value. So and both of those guys signed 2 to 3 year deals. So you're probably like, that's the range I'd be thinking about. Those are the numbers I'd be thinking about. I mean, anything more than that probably becomes too sizable, just considering what this team has wanted to do financially this offseason and into the future. So that's kind of how I would talk about that situation. Again, I'm not going to be surprised one way or another if something were to happen in the next few days, or if it goes months and he still hasn't signed, and the Vikings just are very smart with how they approach it. But I just the summary would be anybody expecting, this didn't happen Wednesday. What are the Vikings dropped the ball? That's just not probably how I would view that situation. Next question comes from Warren Ludford. How has Brian Flores' status influence within the organization changed since he was extended? So first, I think part of this question, and I'm inferring this from Warren probably, but I imagine the question derives from a lot of the commentary, I think, from some anonymous executives and such in recent days, just regarding the Vikings draft. And there have been a lot of comments of like it seems like Brian Flores was had a major say in that thing, and a lot of those picks have Brian Flores written all over them. And I mean, I can just say over the course of the draft, talking to people throughout the league, like that was a very prevalent sentiment of the types of guys the Vikings are taking here have coaching influence written all over it. I guess the way I'd answer the initial question, Warren, is like I would say going back to when Brian Flores first got here, like he's had a lot of influence on defensive personnel, and that is twofold. One, the Vikings, since he got here, have had a very specific scheme with a lot of versatility and a need for a lot of smart players. And so, if you, as any organization in the NFL, if you want your organization to operate the right way, you probably need to hear what the coaches and defensive coordinator and offensive coordinator prefer, to then make sure you're giving them guys who they feel comfortable with. I'd say, like, even you go back to some of those 23 draft picks. I'm thinking about Mekhi Blackman. Like, there's no question that the Vikings wouldn't have done that without Brian Flores being intrigued by Mekhi Blackman. I'd say in 2024, a guy like Dallas Turner was definitely like a really good fit for what this system is. And so there's no doubt that Brian Flores' evaluation mattered there. I'd say free agency in 2024. Andrew Van Ginkel was the ultimate Brian Flores guy. You want to talk about Jonathan Grenard, you talk about Blake Cashman. There's the stories about, Brian Flores talking to Blake Cashman's college coach at Minnesota and that intriguing him then. I mean, in 2025, Javon Hargrave, Jonathan Allen, those had Brian Flores opinions written all over him. So did Jeff Okudah, the cornerback. So, I guess I don't really. I mean, yes, he was extended and paid a premium to remain the defensive coordinator here, but I haven't really perceived it even after this draft as like, the influence is above and beyond what it has been, because I think it's already been pretty impactful over the last few years. If anything, I kind of think that now more than ever, after spending 3 years watching Brian Flores and his defenses and knowing what he prefers, I imagine this scouting staff, which has been with the Vikings throughout his whole time here, has more of an understanding of the types of players that he looks for and likes, like more than anything else. And so that probably helps or I would say just like funnel the correct players or the right players that Brian Flores values into where there's probably more alignment there because of the scouting staff understanding his preferences. So that's kind of how I would talk about that one. I would just, and I've said this on this podcast, if you listen, and if you've listened for 2 years now, like I've made it abundantly clear now for a long time that there has been a major coaching influence on personnel, draft and free agency for some time with this team. And it's why I think I was asked, I mean, months ago, and it was like, what is the one thing that Vikings fans might not that would surprise them? And I think I think at the time the answer I gave was that, like, although Kwesi Adofo-Mensah was the general manager, that, like, there was a lot of influence from a lot of different places within the decisions that a lot of them that he was critiqued for at times. So that's kind of how I'd go about that one. But it's a good question, Warren. Thank you for asking it. The next one comes from Purple Nurple. Let me see if I can find it. The question is, do you think we see Caleb Tiernan's fat man speed in any jumbo packages? So Caleb Tiernan was the 97th pick in the draft, the tackle from Northwestern. And the fat man speed is a reference for sure to the story I had at The Athletic, where I quoted Bill O'Boyle, who was the offensive line coach at Northwestern the last couple of years with Caleb Tiernan, saying that he thought Caleb Tiernan had some sneaky fat man speed. This comment was actually in reference to like how much Northwestern loved using Caleb Tiernan on screens and kind of leaking out and leading out on the left side in front of attempts to the sideline, to the flat, etc. I mean, I watched. It's interesting. This question is funny, but it's also good because I watched last night, three guys on film. I watched Big Citrus, who I'd watched before, but not a lot. I watched Caleb Tiernan, and I watched Jacoby Thomas, the safety from Miami, who I'd watched a little bit, but I wanted to dive back into it. Tiernan, I mean, this guy is massive. That's the first thing I'll say on tape. Like he's listed at 6'7", and you can see all of that on tape. Now, he moves pretty light on his feet for that size. Like he is not just this turnstile where he does not have the range. The arm length stuff and I would say just like physicality at the point of attack is something against NFL type players that's going to be interesting to watch his development. The film I watched was against Derek Moore of Michigan, who I think the Lions took in the second or third round. There were a couple times where he beat him across his face, but there were also a couple times where Caleb Tiernan, like, and I don't pretend to be the offensive line expert, but from a hand placement perspective, like he'd lose quick, but then he'd recover with certain, repositioning of his hands and his arms. So that will help I think both the light feet and the technical refinement will help combat some of that physicality and just the long arm ability of a lot of these NFL edge rushers. As far as the jumbo packages, and I'll answer a question a little later on the run game, but I mean that definitely became a trend throughout the league in 2025, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see it at all, whether it's Caleb Tiernan or whether it's Ryan Vandemark, the RFA that they poached from Buffalo. I mean, that was a player they really wanted. The fact that Buffalo did not match that RFA tender made people internally very excited. And he, similar to Caleb Tiernan, is just this massive player with major juice. I'd say juice at the point of attack in terms of just ability to fire off the ball and create dents in the defense. I'd say this, like, I wouldn't be shocked if it's, Ryan Vandemark is more of your jumbo tight tackle in the run game. And then you have, like, in the event there's injury or something happens, you might feel comfortable with Caleb Tiernan on an island as a pass protector at the position. So I just think, like, someone asked, and I'll probably get to this question too, like, just about depth with this team and where else they might need it. And I just think if you consider the difference in the tackle depth in 2026 versus 2025, and it was Christian Darrisaw, Brian O'Neill, Justin School, and Walter Rouse. And now you got Christian Darrisaw, Brian O'Neill, um, you got Ryan Vandemark, and you got Caleb Tiernan, and just the level of explosiveness from the depth, the level of experience from the depth, the level of upside even from the depth is just far and away, I think, what it was in 2025. And so I mean, Caleb Tiernan, a lot of people like think of him as swing tackle, and maybe that's just the ultimate ceiling is for 10 years he's going to be a really, really good and reliable swing tackle in the NFL. Like, I do think there is a world in which, given his smarts and given his toughness, like, that's the one, talking to coaches and people who have been spent time around him, they're like, this dude has this quiet, like, edge to him that I think they really valued as part of the evaluation. So in the event we're looking at this thing 5 years from now, and it's like he doesn't have the longest arms, but he's able to play with that because of his mobility in his lower half. Like, I'm not going to be the most surprised person in the world either. Next question comes from Suits Bear, and I thought this was a really good one. Who in the organization has the most at stake this season? I mean, like, there are a lot of ways you could go about this answer. the obvious would be the quarterbacks. Another obvious one would obviously be Kevin O'Connell, the Vikings head coach, and can they get the Vikings back on the path that they were in 22 and 24? But the answer I'm going to give you here is actually ownership. Like, I think ownership has the most at stake in the 2026 season. And here's why I would give you that answer. Um, Ownership hired Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell in 2022. That was the path. They um they extended Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. They extended Kevin O'Connell. They ended up firing Kwesi Adofo-Mensah late in the cycle, which pushes back and then they roll with Rob Brzezinski as the interim. Now, as part of the GM search, they have hired a search firm, Turnkey, which has been around professional and college sports for a long time. I believe they worked with the Atlanta Falcons on their most recent search. And so, that's part of how they're going about this process. They also, in their statement, they said they've got a small advisory committee. It's my understanding that Andrew Miller, the COO of the team, is probably going to be a part of that committee. Andrew was a major voice in hiring Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. And so I just think with the way this whole thing has played out from the beginning of January, where you're firing the guy you extended, you're delaying the search until after the draft, and you're making Rob Brzezinski the interim. Now you're hiring the search firm to help you vet candidates as part of this GM process. Like, for me, it's just at some point, I do think you're going to have to answer the question of, like, what is with this GM specifically, even it's like, so what are you looking for here? You say, ownership has said in statements leadership, but is Rob Brzezinski, is there a potential that he could be elevated to president of football ops? What if that were to happen, what is the defined role for everybody within this whole process? Like, I think they have, in ownership has in many ways opened itself up to those types of questions being asked. And so, like, just that was my Suits Bear, the user on Twitter, when they asked this question, like, that was just the first, that was the flash bulb that popped in my head, for right or wrong. And you guys probably have thoughts on that for good or bad. But I mean, look, this ownership group, like, this team hasn't won a playoff game since 2019. This is going to be the 7th year since then. There have been a lot of different iterations. And, like, I mean, I remember doing a story on the draft and the uncertainty of the draft, just writ large, not Vikings related, couple years ago, and I'll never forget a lot of the quotes in that story of, like, you can never overestimate or overstate the role ownership plays in the organizations that thrive or the organizations that don't. And so I just think oftentimes you don't talk about it because they're not often in the eye, in the public eye. But for me, and when I got this question, like, that's just where I went. So it's going to be fascinating to watch play out both the GM search, how that's discussed, what the process was, and how that's explained. All of that. Kind of a little bit of a ramble there, but if you've listened to the Alec Lewis show at this point, you probably know it's coming at some point. And either you love it or you hate it. And if you listen, that's totally okay. And I'll take feedback anywhere I can possibly get it. The next question comes from Skulldoc at Skull_Doc. Did you have a sense that the Vikings would hit the trenches as hard as they did leading up to the draft? I would say I'd be lying if I said I thought that 3 of their first 4 picks would be linemen, and that the first 4 picks would all have, like, experience on the line of scrimmage, because Jake Golday, who was picked at 51, has that. But I'd hedge it a little bit with, like, I remember late in the season, I got a text from an agent who is plugged in and tied in, and they're like, I wouldn't be surprised to see them take a tackle pretty early. And I think I wrote that at some point. And then I'd say in the days leading up to the draft, or really in the weeks leading up to the draft, I heard a lot about defensive linemen in certain pockets. So, like, I was hearing about defensive linemen in, like, a 4th roundish pocket. I'm like, But if they're interested at the top, how could that make? And then obviously it all comes together when you see the final picture. But I'd be lying if I said I expected it to be that aggressive in the trenches. And I would say there were also other iterations of players falling to certain spots where it didn't necessarily have to look exactly like that. But there is no doubt, having talked to people in the aftermath, that building this thing from the inside out is something that the best have done and the Vikings are mindful of and that they wanted to do. And so, yeah, I that's probably the best way I know to answer that one. The next question comes from a username BD97. I gotta find this. How far down the proverbial road is the GM search? No way they sat on their hands in regards to this since January, right? Well, I mean, I would say this, like, they've definitely done a lot of due diligence behind the scenes. And that is, I mean, I remember running into Mark Wilf in the lobby of the JW Marriott at the NFL scouting combine, and that was not typical. And that to me was a bit of a glimpse into the laying of the foundation of what this process was going to be. But I'll say this, like, I've had a ton of conversations over the last week with agents in the coaching and executive space, and like, they're just now having conversations, I would say, with Turnkey, the search firm. So it's not like everything 2 months ago happened, and Turnkey has helped them find the direct candidate. So I'd say Mark Wolf was pretty open at the owners meetings that they wanted to focus on the draft and then get to it right after the draft. And it feels like, for the most part, other than some of the due diligence that they've done on their own, and the due diligence obviously to settle on Turnkey helping them with the search, that this thing's going to play out over the next few weeks. And I'll say this too, just because we're on the subject, and this probably answers a ton of other questions that I receive. But, like, I expect Rob Brzezinski to be a candidate with this thing. Like, there, for a lot of reasons, you could understand why Rob would be a really good candidate. I mean, there's a lot of internal support for him. And I think over the last 3 months, while you can nitpick a lot of, decision making, what you can't really say is that he didn't make decisions within that have short-term effects and long-term effects. And in this business, in this league, there are a lot of people who get in these roles at the top, and they will mask certain decisions as for the team that are actually for themselves. And I really don't believe that Rob did that, which I'm not surprised by. And it's also a testament to him. But I mean, look, there is the question, a lot of people within the league have their eyes on this position, because I think, in the sense that they are very curious what's going to happen here, because I mean, Kwesi Adolfo-Mitz's record was what it was, and so I think the question from a lot of people is, like, who can the Vikings find that they can plug in to the current setup, with coaches who, understandably, in many cases, have a lot of say and have a lot of influence on the roster and on players they covet and all of that. Like, who can come in without a ton of prior relationships potentially, and then have the awareness and the feel to lead from that point forward. Like, I mean, I think I say you, and I'm probably just speaking to Vikings ownership and the search firm Turnkey. Like, you have to be very mindful of the personality and the feel and awareness and EQ of the person who is going to step into this infrastructure in this building, and try to get everybody rowing on the same boat in direct alignment and collaboration with synergy. Like, those words are phenomenal. And I think in some of the best buildings in the NFL, those words ring true. But to get them to ring true for this Vikings organization, it's going to take someone who is very sharp, very aware, very capable, and probably has the amount of experience that would be respected by others. And so, I mean, like, you're whittling it down probably to a very finite amount of people, and I think that's why Rob Brzezinski's name is obviously among them. So that's, again, it's kind of a tangent, but the more I talk to people, the more I think about it, the more that is kind of the currency, I would say, of what's being discussed in many ways within the league. Brian Vossen asked thoughts on actions for edge depth. Bo Richter and Chaz Chambliss as depth concerning with a potential injury. Yeah, I mean, I think for sure I will be curious over the next few weeks and months. It feels to me like you'd absolutely have to add another edge rusher in some form or fashion. I also thought the UDFA crop of edge rushers was fairly light for the Vikings in terms of the guys they brought in. And so that would add more, I'd say, logs on top of the fire that burns of the need for probably more edge rusher depth. And part of it is, I mean, it's challenging. It's hard to find depth for Andrew Van Ginkel because of all the jobs that he does. Probably easier to find someone who could play more of the Dallas Turner role, and it's probably necessary, even though he hasn't navigated a ton of injuries other than the knees over time. So, yeah, I'd also say with edge, like there were other iterations of the late rounds of the draft where that could have been a possibility. But the fact that they didn't come away with a premium UDFA guy at that spot probably is an indication to me that you're going to need to spend something on that position. So it's one I'll definitely be watching. Let's see here. Randall rules. How much influence will the non-football people have on the process? See Andrew Miller. Judd Zolgad spoke on the influence he had with not hiring Jim Harbaugh, which obviously had nothing to do with Harbaugh's pedigree as a head coach. Yeah, I mean, I again, like, I think this is part of what ownership is going to have to explain after the fact, regardless of what ends up happening. And I think Andrew Miller, for those who don't know, he's a COO of this team. He definitely has played a big role in the business side. He has a baseball background where he spent a lot of time with the Cleveland Guardians organization, which has operated very sharply and above budget a lot. But I think part of like the question would be, how much influence is Andrew Miller going to have coming off of the last hiring with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah? If he does have influence, what does that mean for the more, I'd say, scouting oriented type candidates? Like, these are all questions again that people in the league definitely have. So it's rightful to ask them. Jack Spinner. From what I've seen, Caleb Banks is athletic enough to play a 5 technique. That is correct, Jack. You know ball. Do you think that will happen? Or would someone like Gink or Turner play there? No, I think that definitely is possible, Jack. Like I'm looking at this thing and I've got it penciled in. If I'm looking at a 5 down front that the Vikings tend to play at times, whether they are actually playing with odd spacing or even spacing, that's a Flores conundrum that offenses have to figure out. But if you're talking about a 5-man front, I think in the heart of hearts of the Vikings, it would look like Dallas Turner, Jalen Redmond, Dominique Orange, Caleb Banks, and Andrew Van Ginkel. Now, 2 of those guys are rookies. Caleb Banks, obviously recovering from the most recent surgery. Dallas Turner has gotten a lot of experience, or did over the back half of last season, but there's uncertainty there. And I think part of the way my mind works, for right or wrong, is like that 5 has the potential to be very menacing, but it also has the potential, if Caleb Banks, doesn't clear the hurdles that I would expect him to clear by training camp. But, if that doesn't happen, if Dominique Orange isn't ready, if there's an injury to one of the other 3 reliable guys, then you're thin at a lot of spots. And so, like, I do think there is a world where it is, this team is imposing its will, and I do think there's another world where it's like, man, that was a lot to put on some of these guys, and that's why Brian Flores is having to be real creative to kind of maneuver the front. So watching that play out, I think will be interesting to me, at least. Kay Delisle, Alec, where does Flores view Jake Golday fitting in your opinion? I mean, Jake Golday, the linebacker from Cincinnati. This guy is, he is the quintessential example of the versatility that Brian Flores seeks. He's played on the edge. He's played off the ball. He's played like a nickelish type position at 6'5", 240, which is absolutely absurd to kind of take away throw RPOs and throws to the alley. So I think in the best case scenario, it's probably off the ball with a little bit of development to see how much he can be on the ball and improve on the ball. But the skill set is there. I mean, he is really smart. He can pick things up pretty quickly from everything I understand. And so how they try to use him, I think, will be telling. I also they have two starting linebackers in Blake Cashman and Eric Wilson. So expecting him to take one of those guys' spots is pretty lofty. I think early on, it's probably a no-brainer special teams demon type of player. And then over the course of the season, depending on injuries, all the other factors, like he could probably garner more of a role, as the season progresses. That's kind of how I view it in the short term. All right, we'll keep rolling because I got so many good ones. I really can't stop at this point. Nick Miller asks, has Turnkey called you to the interview for the GM job? No, they have not. And I don't have an agent to put a feeler out, unfortunately. But it would probably be good for negotiation purposes. If you had to pick a member in the Vikings media space to be the GM, who would it be and why is it Judd? Judd would be a good candidate. Dane Mizutani of the Pioneer Press would be my candidate for sure. He would be able to work with everybody. Everybody would laugh, build consensus. Dane would have that. Dane would have that ability. I truly believe that. And I don't think I'd be alone in saying that. I think that would have a lot of support from people. Let's see here. Scooger asks, with the IPP International Pathway Program slot, is there a scenario where Thorson is the punter and Hecker is the holder this season? That would be wild, wouldn't it? First of all, I'd say the International Pathway Program only applies, once cuts happen to the practice squad. So that would require Brett Thorson clearing waivers. And what I know about Brett Thorson, for you guys who are like, what is he talking about? So the Vikings signed this undrafted free agent punter from Georgia, Brett Thorson. He was the Ray Guy Award winner. He is an absolute stud from everything I've talked to. Like I've got buddies who are big time Georgia fans, and they're texting me about Brett Thorson, and it's making me really uncomfortable. Anyway, I would say this is going to be an interesting one because if he has a great spring, summer, and fall, and Johnny Hecker is, what is his age? I should have looked this up beforehand, but hold on. Johnny Hecker is 36 years old, just turned 36. Like if the Vikings deem this could, it's a 1-year thing and you'd rather have Brett Thorson in the future, would you as the Vikings and whoever the GM ultimately ends up being and Kevin O'Connell, like, are you willing to use one of the 53 spots to kind of stash a punter? That is a pretty probably lofty ask. But if he's that impressive over the course of this offseason, I don't know. Like maybe you even think about it, and then the holding is going to be a big part of it. Like I think I often laugh at the significance of the holder spot, but anything that messes with Will Reichert at this point is a very big negative for a team that has needed him, that will continue to need him, and that it's understandable that they need him because of how good he is. So. I'm all for a little bit of a punter competition, a little punter activity this summer and fall. I'll track it, no doubt about it. Carl Johnson at Carl from Lake Elmo. We've seen this movie before. We draft a highly respected blocking fullback. We draft a shifty electric. That was almost bad. Shifty electric RB2. Hire a renowned run game coordinator in Frank Smith, only to watch us refuse to run the ball. Is this the year KOC finally relents? Well, I'd say drafting a highly respected blocking fullback has not happened, nor has the hiring of a renowned run game coordinator like Frank Smith. So those two are different. But I'm just to this point with the run game. Until I see the drastic difference or improvement, it's just not going to be easy for me to go down that road. And that even includes come the spring, the summer, and the fall. Like, I want to see what the offensive linemen are doing on the practice field. I'll probably get sunburnt out behind some tent trying to see if the offensive, like, what drills the offensive line are running with Keith Carter and Derek Warheim and Frank Smith. Like, if you see a burnt red, cherry red face, watching offensive line play, you probably know that it's me, because it is important, and I do think I'm very curious about it. And Kevin O'Connell, to his credit, he did. I mean, at the combine, he did talk about wanting to be more of a vertical wide zone team. So again, for me, it's what does that look like? How does that look on a daily basis? That's stuff I'm going to be watching and following, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing some of that over the course of next few months. Let's see here. Any more that are worth getting to? Someone asked, what has the dynamic been between JJ McCarthy and Kyler Murray? We have not been around for practice yet or any of the workouts. That'll probably start at some point in the coming week. So hard to really get a feel other than you have a couple conversations, but it hasn't been enough time to have any real say. Zeke 12 asks, which Viking can step in and play guard for the Timberwolves tonight? Great question. I think the answer that I would have given if Justin Jefferson was not in Shanghai doing his world tour, the way that he does, spreading the game and his personality, he would probably be my pick. I mean, they've got a mini hoop in the locker room, and I watch guys shoot. Cam Akers couldn't make a shot at all, so it wouldn't be. And he's no longer on the team, so it wouldn't be him. I mean, Isaiah Rodgers probably could play a little bit. There's probably a basketball guy Caleb Banks he wasn't a guard. That's for dang sure, Alec. I don't know. I'm going to continue to think on that one. That's something that I'm going to put time in. But yeah, that'll probably do it for episode 163 of the Alec Lewis Show. Thank you guys who sent questions. I'd say if you got more, toss them in the comments section on YouTube as you hit the subscribe button, or even I think on like Spotify you can toss comments over there. So or at me on social media at Alec_Lewis, at Alec Lewis Show on Instagram. Been doing a little sneaky Q&A all the time over there, so that's a good spot for questions. But yeah, thank you guys for being here. Appreciate First Resource Bank for their support. Same goes for Pro and Men Athletics. And yeah, thank you guys. Has fun to cover the draft. We'll have much more next week. Been working deep on some Caleb Banks stuff. So yeah, stay tuned, and we will talk to you guys very, very soon.